Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about defining perversion in medieval times. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What if you were judged by the morals of a future you couldn't even imagine? That's the challenge when looking at medieval history. Defining perversion back then isn't as simple as pulling up a modern dictionary, unless that dictionary is written in Latin and illuminated with questionable doodles. The medieval world had its own rules, often dictated by the church, feudal society, and a general lack of indoor plumbing. We can't just impose our 21st century values on folks who thought bathing was optional, can we? I mean, imagine someone from the Middle Ages judging our obsession with TikTok dances. Now that we've set the stage, let's dig into the historical context. Imagine trying to explain Netflix to someone who thinks the Earth is flat. That's the level of difference we're dealing with. The medieval concept of sin was deeply intertwined with societal norms. What the church deemed sinful, lust, gluttony, greed, the usual suspects, often translated into crimes against the social order. But here's the thing. What was considered a sin could vary wildly depending on your social status. For peasants, stealing a loaf of bread might be a mortal sin. But for a king, well, maybe it was just borrowing from his subjects. The difference was that in a world with limited resources and strict hierarchy, maintaining order was paramount, like trying to herd cats, but with swords and fewer cat videos. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was constant warfare and starvation, a little hypocrisy was a small price to pay. Speaking of social status, this brings us to power dynamics. Picture this. You're a medieval monarch, dripping in velvet, and wielding absolute authority. Who's going to call you out on your questionable behavior? Probably not your court jester, unless he has a death wish. Accusations of perversion were often weaponized. A king could easily accuse a rival of some unspeakable act to discredit them and seize their lands. It's like a medieval version of Twitter beef, but with actual swords. The difference was the stakes. Today, being canceled might mean losing your job. Back then, it could mean losing your head. From power dynamics to the sources of our knowledge, it's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing in the box covered in mud. Our understanding of medieval perversions comes from a variety of sources: court records, chronicles written by monks, and, of course, good old-fashioned gossip. Here's the problem. These sources are rarely objective. Court records might be sanitized to protect the reputation of the ruling class. Chronicles might exaggerate or fabricate stories to make a point. And gossip? Well, gossip is gossip. Like a medieval game of telephone, but with rumors of scandalous behavior. But what good is truth without a juicy rumor or two? Key takeaway. Medieval accusations were often political tools, disguised as moral outrage. What would you do if you were tasked with judging a medieval king by modern standards? It's tempting to condemn behaviors that we find abhorrent today, but it's also crucial to understand the context in which these behaviors occurred. We can't simply erase the past because it doesn't align with our present-day values. Instead, we must strive to understand it, to learn from it, and to use it to inform our understanding of human nature. Now that we've considered the challenges of judging the past, let's consider how medieval society itself viewed certain behaviors. Imagine a society where the lines between religious devotion, political maneuvering, and personal gratification were often blurred. That's the medieval world for you. The church wielded immense power, shaping moral codes and influencing everything from marriage to inheritance. But even within the church, there were cracks and fissures. Some clergy members were genuinely pious, while others were more interested in accumulating wealth and power. It's like a medieval version of corporate bureaucracy, but with more Latin and less workplace diversity training. Key takeaway: the medieval church's influence was pervasive, but not monolithic. But what good is religious doctrine without a little hypocrisy? Long before modern scandals rocked religious institutions, the medieval church had its share of sinners and hypocrites. Some clergy members engaged in the very behaviors they condemned, creating a climate of moral ambiguity. This hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed. Critics of the church often pointed to the discrepancy between its teachings and its practices, fueling discontent and sowing seeds of doubt. It's like a medieval version of "do as I say, not as I do," but with eternal consequences. The difference was the power imbalance. Criticizing the church could be a dangerous game, punishable by excommunication or even death. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was eternal damnation, a little silence was a small price to pay. From hypocrisy to outright rebellion, this brings us to the concept of sin versus crime. Imagine a world where the laws of God and the laws of the land were often intertwined. In the medieval period, many behaviors were considered both sinful and criminal. But the consequences for these behaviors could vary depending on the severity of the offense and the social status of the offender. Stealing, for example, was both a sin against God and a crime against property. But the punishment for stealing could range from a public flogging to imprisonment to execution, depending on the value of the stolen goods and the social standing of the thief. It's like a medieval version of the legal system, but with less due process and more divine intervention. The difference was the arbitrariness of justice. In a world where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, justice was often dispensed according to the whims of the powerful. From arbitrariness to blatant corruption, let's consider how accusations could be weaponized. What would you do if you were falsely accused of a crime or sin? In the medieval period, accusations could be devastating. Even if you were innocent, the mere accusation could ruin your reputation, damage your career, and even lead to your execution. False accusations were often used as a tool to eliminate rivals, seize property, or settle scores. It's like a medieval version of character assassination, but with real stakes. Key takeaway: in the medieval world, accusations could be as dangerous as a sword. Now that we've explored the weaponization of accusations, let's talk about the difficulty of separating fact from fiction. If you've ever tried to unravel a tangled web of rumors and half-truths, you know how challenging it can be to get to the bottom of things. In the medieval period, this challenge was even greater. The sources of information were often unreliable, and the truth was often obscured by political agendas, religious biases, and personal vendettas. It's like a medieval version of fake news, but with fewer fact-checkers and more pitchforks. But what good is history without a little speculation? Now we need to turn towards what could be considered a perversion from the medieval period. We need to understand what was important at the time. The key element of life was survival and keeping your bloodline running.
The embers glow low,
casting long shadows as we settle in for a little late-night history. Tonight's topic: kings. And not just any kings, the ones history has whispered about. The ones whose reigns were as much about scandal as they were about statecraft. Think of it as a medieval soap opera, but with slightly less appealing fashion choices. What would you do if absolute power, immense wealth, and the unquestioning loyalty of thousands were yours? We turn our gaze towards late medieval France. Now, France during this period, let's say roughly from the 14th to the 16th centuries, was a powerhouse, culturally and politically. The French court became the gold standard for European nobility. Everyone wanted to be French, or at least to imitate French courtly life. But behind the glimmering facade of elaborate dresses and ridiculously large wigs lay, well, let's just say some questionable behavior. Speaking of questionable behavior, imagine Louis XIV getting caught trying to explain Bitcoin to Colbert. The cultural whiplash alone would be enough to give you insomnia. Let's start with wealth. We all know that kings are supposed to live in fancy palaces, but the sheer opulence of the French court often bordered on the absurd. Picture this: a king so obsessed with displaying his riches that he orders fountains filled with wine for public celebrations. Sounds fun, right? Until you realize that wine could have been used to feed thousands of starving peasants. It's like buying a solid gold toilet while your neighbors are living in cardboard boxes. Kings were expected to be generous, but sometimes the line between generosity and ostentatious waste became blurred. But what good is a solid gold toilet when there's no plumbing? Seriously, think about it. Now that we've covered the golden toilets, let's discuss some intimate details of their life. Then there's the matter of, shall we say, extracurricular activities. Medieval morality was a complicated beast. On the one hand, the Church preached strict adherence to religious doctrine. On the other hand, powerful men often felt entitled to indulge their desires, consequences be damned. Now that we've addressed the moral complexities, let's shift to the realm of absolute power. Long before Twitter mobs, kings faced a different kind of public opinion. But even without social media, dissent could be dangerous. Imagine trying to start a revolution in the age of knights and castles. Long before TikTok dances, kings faced challenges to their authority. Some kings were known for ruthlessly suppressing any form of opposition. Criticism of the monarchy could be interpreted as treason, punishable by imprisonment, torture, or even execution. Now that we have addressed suppression, let's understand more about inspiration. Speaking of execution, even the executioners are inspired to have a unique French style. It wasn't just France, of course. Other European courts, inspired by the French model, often mirrored these behaviors. From England to Spain to the various Italian city-states, tales of lavish spending, sexual intrigue, and political maneuvering abounded. Think of the Borgias. They make the Lannisters look like amateur players in the Game of Thrones. Ever wonder why historical dramas are so popular? It's because human nature, with all its flaws and foibles, remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. But medieval people lacked the tools of modernity for control.
Medieval preservation wasn't about flavor, it was about not dying. When you can't buy light, you make it from whatever burns. In modern society, political scandals are broadcast worldwide instantly. But there wasn't the concept of going viral in those days, except maybe in the literal sense, if someone contracted a particularly nasty plague. The difference was the speed and scope of information dissemination. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but gossip traveled fast, especially among the noble classes. When your alternative was complete isolation, any bit of news, no matter how scandalous, was eagerly devoured. Now that we've explored the spread of gossip, let's shift our attention to the delicate balance of power. Here's the thing. Power, like a fine wine, can intoxicate even the most well-intentioned individuals. Get this. Even good kings can make bad decisions, especially when they're surrounded by sycophants and yes-men. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that even the most powerful figures in history were still, at the end of the day, human beings with all the flaws and complexities that come with the territory. And maybe, just maybe, that realization will help you rest a little easier tonight. Key takeaway: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
The chill of night settles, and thoughts drift like smoke. Tonight we consider the Holy Roman Emperors, a line often depicted as paragons of piety and power. But history, as always, is a tapestry woven with threads of darkness and light. Were these emperors truly holy, or did the trappings of power mask something far more human, perhaps even something monstrous? What if the very notion of holy became a shield for behavior that defied its principles? Imagine being crowned by God, essentially untouchable. It's like having an unlimited credit card with no repercussions. But instead of buying sports cars, you're indulging in other things. Now that's a thought. Now, before we paint every emperor with the same brush, it's crucial to acknowledge the sources. Many accounts of their alleged debauchery come from rivals, both political and religious. Think of it as medieval Twitter wars, but with far more at stake than trending hashtags. Imagine Martin Luther firing off a scathing tweet storm, only instead of 280 characters, it's a pamphlet accusing the emperor of, well, you get the idea. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. Speaking of murky, let's wade into some specific cases. Take, for example, Emperor Sigismund. While remembered for his role in resolving the Western Schism, whispers of his personal life suggest a less than saintly existence. Stories circulated regarding his extravagant spending and alleged proclivities. But medieval life was full of whispers, wasn't it? One had to remember some are true and some are false. From Sigismund to others, a pattern emerges. Accusations of cruelty, lavish displays of wealth that seem to mock the poverty of their subjects, and a general disregard for the moral standards they were supposed to uphold. It's like a modern-day politician caught in a scandal, only instead of a leaked email, it's a detailed chronicle penned by a disgruntled nunk with an axe to grind. But let's all remember, some monks also enjoyed axes to grind. But what good is power without a little self-indulgence, right? In the context of the time, where life was often brutal and short, perhaps these emperors simply sought fleeting moments of pleasure and escape. Or perhaps they were genuinely flawed individuals who used their position to exploit and abuse. Key takeaway: power corrupts, and absolute power, well, you know the rest. Now that we've considered the accusations, let's delve deeper into the political motivations behind them. In the medieval world, controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling territory. Smearing an emperor's reputation could destabilize their rule and pave the way for rivals to seize power. It's like a hostile takeover, but with character assassination as the weapon of choice. Here's the thing. Accusing an emperor of heresy or moral depravity was a potent tool. It could rally religious factions against them and undermine their legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects. Imagine trying to govern when half your kingdom thinks you're in league with the devil. It's a tough sell, even with the best PR team. But medieval people were not dummies. The populace watched the political chess between emperors and their naysayers. They were like modern audiences, carefully analyzing political debates. Yet the problem was not the lack of analysis, rather the lack of choice. Speaking of PR, the Church often played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion. Popes and other religious leaders wielded immense influence, and their pronouncements could make or break an emperor's reign. If the Pope declared you an enemy of God, you were pretty much toast. It's like getting cancelled in the 15th century, but with eternal damnation as the ultimate consequence. Now that we're thinking about motivations, let's think about alternatives. The alternative of a smear campaign or accusations of misconduct might be the truth itself. Remember, medieval life was short, brutal, and full of backstabbing. Why wouldn't leaders seize every advantage or pleasure available to them? From political maneuvering to religious fervor, the motivations behind these accusations were complex and multifaceted. Disentangling truth from propaganda is a daunting task, but it's essential for understanding the complexities of the Holy Roman Empire. Key takeaway: history is rarely black and white. It's a swirling vortex of agendas and perspectives. Now that we've examined the accusations and the motivations, let's consider the broader context of medieval society. What was considered normal or acceptable behavior then might seem shocking to us today. It's like comparing dating customs in the 21st century to, well, pretty much any other century. Expectations change. Here's the thing. Medieval society was deeply hierarchical and often brutally unequal. The lives of peasants were vastly different from those of the nobility, and what was permissible for the elite was often forbidden to the common folk. It's like having different sets of rules for different classes, only the rules for the elite were written in invisible ink. But what good are rules if you don't plan to break them? Perhaps those emperors planned every single one of the supposed transgressions. Speaking of rules, the concept of morality itself was often fluid and subject to interpretation. Religious doctrines were constantly evolving, and what was considered heretical one day might be perfectly acceptable the next. It's like the ever-changing terms and conditions of a social media platform, only with far more significant consequences. From social structures to evolving moral codes, the context of medieval society is crucial for understanding the actions of the Holy Roman Emperors. Judging them by modern standards would be anachronistic and unfair. Key takeaway: context is king. The night deepens, and our thoughts turn to those figures who seem to straddle the line between saint and sinner. The Holy Roman Emperors were undoubtedly complex individuals, shaped by the forces of their time. Were they truly paragons of virtue, or were they flawed humans who succumbed to the temptations of power? The answer, as always, remains elusive. Perhaps the truth is buried beneath layers of propaganda, political intrigue, and the endless march of time.
The weight of a crown. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? All that power, all that glory. But what if that crown sat on a head prone to mischief, or worse? Across the Channel, in the realm of the English monarchy, such scenarios were not uncommon. We're about to delve into the less-than-savory tales of some England's most interesting kings. What would you do if you were suddenly the most powerful man in the land? The temptation to indulge in every whim must be immense. Consider William the Conqueror, a man who seized the throne through sheer force. While he is remembered for the Domesday Book and solidifying Norman rule, whispers of his ruthless ambition and, let's just say, robust appetites followed him. He wasn't exactly known for his temperance. Imagine the medieval equivalent of road rage, but with an army. Now that we've covered the man who started it all, let's talk about his descendants. William Rufus, his son, wasn't much better. Accusations of questionable morals and a lack of piety plagued his reign. People said he wasn't very religiously devout and more into, well, partying. And if that's to be believed, he allegedly held the most wicked parties that England had ever seen. Key takeaway: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in the 11th century. Speaking of corruption, let's mosey on to King John. Ever wonder why he's always portrayed as the villain in Robin Hood stories? It wasn't just because he was a bad tax collector. John had a reputation for cruelty and treachery. He was known for holding grudges and extracting revenge in the most creative ways possible. Picture the medieval equivalent of internet trolling, but with actual dungeons. Ouch. But what good is a scandal without a queen to spice things up? Enter Eleanor of Aquitaine, wife of Henry II. Eleanor wasn't merely a queen, she was a force of nature. She was one of the most powerful women in the medieval world. She basically invented the concept of courtly love. She was so influential that she challenged social norms. Key takeaway: queens weren't always passive figures. Some actively shaped political and cultural landscapes. From adultery to alleged plots against her husband, Eleanor's life reads like a medieval soap opera. Which brings us to the later Plantagenets. Edward II, for example, had an unhealthy attachment to his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston. The nobles, predictably,
were not thrilled. Imagine the scandal of Edward II's inner circle if Twitter had existed. Speaking of uncomfortable royal relationships, we cannot skip Richard the Lionheart. Richard was a brilliant military commander and a charismatic leader, but his reign was short. He only actually spent a few months of it in England. A crusader king who preferred France and warfare to the mundane tasks of governing? This guy makes an appearance in the history books. Now that we've traversed the Norman and Plantagenet dynasties, let's journey into the Tudor era. Henry VIII, of course, looms large. 6 wives, religious upheaval, and a general air of tyrannical swagger. He's the poster child for royal excess. Marrying 6 times to get an heir? Long before online dating, medieval royalty had to make do with courtly intrigue and the occasional beheading. Key takeaway? Henry VIII's marital woes reshaped England's religious landscape permanently. What would it be like to be married to someone who has power to kill? Imagine the anxiety of having a king as a spouse back then, even if that king has many wives and many mistresses. Moving along the list, we find that even powerful queens were accused of missteps. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a very complicated life, full of drama, and she had a reputation for intrigue. But what good is a list of royal scandals without acknowledging the limitations of historical evidence? Accusations and rumors abound, but separating fact from fiction is a challenge. Hearsay was frequently used as proof back then. The point is, some information might not be accurate. Think about how easy it is to twist a story now in the age of the Internet. Now imagine how much easier it would be centuries ago. That's how people made a living then. This is how the world as we know it today was shaped. Key takeaway? History is often written by the victors and sometimes embellished for dramatic effect. The Iberian Peninsula, a land of sun-drenched coasts and shadow-draped mountains, witnessed more than just the clash of swords during the Reconquista. It also cradled secrets, whispers of scandals that echoed within the very stone walls of royal palaces. Ever wonder what secrets those walls might hold? Imagine, if you will, the weight of a crown, not just in gold and jewels, but in expectation. The King of Portugal, Dom Pedro I, for example, he publicly mourned his murdered mistress, Inés de Castro, even having her corpse crowned queen. It's quite the visual, isn't it? You'd think twice about bad-mouthing the king's dead girlfriend at the time. But medieval people had to balance political maneuvering, religious doctrine, and personal desires, a volatile mix, to say the least. Now that we've covered this, let's dive deeper into how monarchs skirted or outright shattered those boundaries. Don Pedro's dramatic mourning, while seemingly romantic, hinted at a deeper, perhaps darker side. Affairs were common enough in royal circles, practically an expected perk, like unlimited breadsticks at a mediocre restaurant. But medieval people had different standards. The difference was that open defiance of the church or blatant disregard for the moral fabric of society could destabilize a kingdom. When the alternative was being overthrown, a secret affair and a bit of hypocrisy suddenly looked brilliant. Now let's turn our attention to Spain. The Spanish monarchs, especially during the later medieval period, often wielded significant power over the church within their realms. This sometimes led to accusations of religious hypocrisy. Key takeaway: royal power often came with the temptation to bend the rules, both earthly and divine. Think of Henry IV of Castile, nicknamed the Impotent. The rumors surrounding his inability to produce an heir fueled political intrigue and accusations of, shall we say, unconventional preferences. Now, you know how social media can blow things out of proportion today. Well, imagine that, but instead of Twitter, you've got gossiping nobles and disgruntled clergymen whispering poison into receptive ears. But medieval people faced the pressure of dynasty. The difference was the king's virility was essentially a matter of national security. Sure, it wasn't fair, but when the alternative was civil war, a good heir, even if questionable, suddenly looked brilliant. From Henry the Impotent to whispers of illegitimate children scattered across Portugal like crumbs from a forgotten feast, the Iberian courts were ripe with scandal. Consider Alfonso VI of Portugal, who faced accusations of paranoia and cruelty. These actions were not always born of pure malice. Political survival often demanded ruthless decisions. Speaking of survival, this brings us to how the Reconquista played a role in shaping the moral landscape. The Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was a crucible. Centuries of conflict shaped a culture defined by religious fervor, military prowess, and a certain pragmatism. Moral lines, especially when dealing with enemies, could become blurred. But what good is a victory if it comes at the cost of your soul? Well, that's a question many medieval monarchs likely pondered before deciding that victory was, indeed, pretty great. Now, you know how people debate the ethics of warfare today. Well, imagine that, but instead of Twitter, you've got gossiping nobles and disgruntled clergymen whispering poison into receptive ears. But medieval people faced the pressure of dynasty. The difference was the king's virility was essentially a matter of national security. Sure, it wasn't fair, but when the alternative was civil war, a good heir, even if questionable, suddenly looked brilliant. From Henry the Impotent to whispers of illegitimate children scattered across Portugal like crumbs from a forgotten feast, the Iberian courts were ripe with scandal. Consider Alfonso VI of Portugal, who faced accusations of paranoia and cruelty. These actions were not always born of pure malice. Political survival often demanded ruthless decisions. Speaking of survival, this brings us to how the Reconquista played a role in shaping the moral landscape. The Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was a crucible. Centuries of conflict shaped a culture defined by religious fervor, military prowess, and a certain pragmatism. Moral lines, especially when dealing with enemies, could become blurred. But what good is a victory if it comes at the cost of your soul? Well, that's a question many medieval monarchs likely pondered before deciding that victory was, indeed, pretty great. Now, you know how social media can blow things out of proportion today. Well, imagine that, but instead of Twitter, you've got gossiping nobles and disgruntled clergymen whispering poison into receptive ears. But medieval people faced the pressure of dynasty. The difference was the king's virility was essentially a matter of national security. Sure, it wasn't fair, but when the alternative was civil war, a good heir, even if questionable, suddenly looked brilliant. From Henry the Impotent to whispers of illegitimate children scattered across Portugal like crumbs from a forgotten feast, the Iberian courts were ripe with scandal. Consider Alfonso VI of Portugal, who faced accusations of paranoia and cruelty. These actions were not always born of pure malice. Political survival often demanded ruthless decisions. Speaking of survival, this brings us to how the Reconquista played a role in shaping the moral landscape. The Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was a crucible. Centuries of conflict shaped a culture defined by religious fervor, military prowess, and a certain pragmatism. Moral lines, especially when dealing with enemies, could become blurred. But what good is a victory if it comes at the cost of your soul? Well, that's a question many medieval monarchs likely pondered before deciding that victory was, indeed, pretty great. Now, you know how social media can blow things out of proportion today. Well, imagine that, but instead of Twitter, you've got gossiping nobles and disgruntled clergymen whispering poison into receptive ears. But medieval people faced the pressure of dynasty. The difference was the king's virility was essentially a matter of national security. Sure, it wasn't fair, but when the alternative was civil war, a good heir, even if questionable, suddenly looked brilliant. From Henry the Impotent to whispers of illegitimate children scattered across Portugal like crumbs from a forgotten feast, the Iberian courts were ripe with scandal. Consider Alfonso VI of Portugal, who faced accusations of paranoia and cruelty. These actions were not always born of pure malice. Political survival often demanded ruthless decisions. Speaking of survival, this brings us to how the Reconquista played a role in shaping the moral landscape. The Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was a crucible. Centuries of conflict shaped a culture defined by religious fervor, military prowess, and a certain pragmatism. Moral lines, especially when dealing with enemies, could become blurred. But what good is a victory if it comes at the cost of your soul? Well, that's a question many medieval monarchs likely pondered before deciding that victory was, indeed, pretty great. Now you know how people debate the ethics of warfare today. Medieval people had similar but life-or-death discussions. Think of the Spanish Inquisition, established in the late 15th century. While primarily focused on religious purity, it also became a tool for political control. Imagine this situation. You're a monarch trying to consolidate power, and suddenly you have an institution that can investigate and punish anyone deemed a threat. Pretty tempting, right? The difference was the scope of the persecutions, the methods employed. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was internal chaos, A little religious persecution suddenly looked necessary. Key takeaway: the Reconquista created a climate where political expediency often trumped traditional morality. Now that we've explored the shadows, let's consider the influence of the Church. The Catholic Church, despite its moral pronouncements, was not immune to the corruption of the time. Some clergymen engaged in practices that contradicted their vows, and accusations of simony were rampant. You could probably say the Church's image took a hit long before Netflix documentaries exposed scandals. Whispers of corruption echoed through cathedrals and monasteries. But medieval people relied on the Church. The difference was that the Church's authority was still immense, even when its integrity was questionable. Speaking of the Church, this brings us to the concept of confession. Confession was a powerful tool for both spiritual cleansing and social control. But picture this: you're a king, and you know that your every sin, every transgression could be revealed through confession. Wouldn't you be tempted to influence the confessor? The confessor, then, might be tempted to influence you. When your alternative was eternal damnation, a bit of strategic confession suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: the Church offered both solace and a stage for hypocrisy. The dark corners of the Iberian Peninsula held secrets of power, desire, and transgression. These kings, like all humans, were flawed, caught between the demands of their positions and the pull of their own desires. We may never know the full extent of their sins, but their stories offer a glimpse into the complex and often contradictory nature of medieval life. As the embers of the day fade into the quiet glow of night, let's reflect on the legacies of infamy we've encountered. How do we remember those monarchs whose reigns were, shall we say, less than virtuous? It's a question that lingers like a shadow in the halls of history. The weight of power, eh? It's a heady thing, even today. If you've ever been given a small task and imagined how powerful you feel in doing the task, now imagine that task magnified 1,000,000 times, backed by armies and coffers overflowing with gold. But medieval kings lacked checks and balances. The difference was that they could get away with practically anything. Key takeaway: absolute power corrupts absolutely, even back then. Speaking of power, what about morality? A moving target, isn't it? What was considered scandalous in the 14th century might be a Tuesday afternoon now, right? But medieval morality was strict and inflexible. The difference was, if you didn't follow these rules, you can face trial. Key takeaway: morality is a product of its time, always shifting like the sands of a desert. Now, how are these perverted kings remembered? Propaganda plays a huge role. Ever wondered why some historical figures are painted as villains and others as heroes? It's all in the spin. In medieval times, they had to rely on traveling minstrels and town criers. The difference was the method of transmitting information. Key takeaway: history is written by the victors and sometimes the spin doctors. And then there are the legends. Oh, the stories that grow like weeds around historical facts. Think of the tales of Richard the Lionheart or Vlad the Impaler, exaggerated beyond recognition. Medieval stories spread by word of mouth and embellished with each retelling. The difference was they had more time to get creative. Key takeaway: legends are the sugar coating on the pill of history. But what about popular culture? Movies, books, TV shows, they all shape our perception of the past. Long before Netflix, people gathered around fires to hear tales of kings and queens. The difference was the accessibility and distribution. Key takeaway: popular culture keeps history alive, even if it's a little bit Frankensteinish. From legends to propaganda, it all adds up to a rather subjective interpretation of history. Here's the thing: we can't just judge these figures by today's standards. To do so would be like judging a medieval knight for not using a smartphone. Medieval people can only work with the tools and knowledge that they have. The difference was the tools. Key takeaway: judging the past by the present is like judging a fish for not being able to climb a tree. Speaking of subjective interpretation, let's look at morality across time. What was acceptable then might be appalling now. Remember, societal norms shift like the tides. Medieval people viewed the morality of things differently than we do now. The difference was the environment. Key takeaway: morality is a reflection of its era, not a universal constant. So why are we so fascinated by these figures? Why do we linger on the stories of their misdeeds? Perhaps it's the thrill of the taboo or the cautionary tale they represent. If you've ever rubbernecked at a car accident, then you would get the point. Medieval people were drawn to drama. The difference was that the consequences was greater. Key takeaway: we are drawn to the dark side, if only to remind ourselves of the light. But what lessons can we learn from these perverted kings? Maybe it's a reminder that power unchecked can lead to ruin, or that morality is a fragile thing. Medieval rulers often had the divine right of kings. The difference was a lack of accountability. Key takeaway: history repeats itself unless we learn from it. Now that we've covered the legacies of infamy, let's talk about the nature of power. It's a dangerous game, always tempting, always corrupting. Power in the hands of medieval kings often translated into absolute control. The difference was the limited options for dissent. Key takeaway: power is a double-edged sword, capable of both great good and great evil. Speaking of the nature of power, let's consider the complexities of human behavior. We are all capable of both good and evil, aren't we? Medieval people, just like us, were capable of both extraordinary acts of kindness and horrifying acts of cruelty. The difference was that their lives were often harsher and more brutal. Key takeaway: human nature is a tangled web, capable of both light and darkness. But what good are these reflections without acknowledging the shared experience of exploring history together during these quiet, introspective hours? As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the lives of these infamous monarchs, I hope you found a sense of quiet companionship in the stories we've unearthed. May these late-night explorations have sparked a sense of wonder and perhaps a little bit of comfort in the vastness of time. And may the lessons gleaned from the past illumine our understanding of the present. as the first rays of dawn begin to paint the horizon, may you find peaceful rest and a renewed appreciation for the complexities of the human story. Until our paths cross again in the annals of history, sleep well.